So, hi, good evening. Welcome to the first 5WH Town Hall. And 5WH, as you know, is a unique online platform that brings together freelance journalists who are looking to sell their ready to use news content and media outlets who are possible buyers of this content. As more and more journalists prefer to work independently, 5WH provides them an opportunity to push their news content to media houses. On the other hand, media houses registered with 5WH get stories from freelance journalists with established credentials. They can buy ready to use content directly from 5WH Marketplace or even commission stories to journalists across continents. So it has been our endeavor at 5WH to act as a bridge or a link between freelance journalists and users, which is the media houses. And towards that end, we are starting a series of online events where the stakeholders can interact and understand each other's needs and requirements. And for today's discussion, let me introduce you to our panelists for the town hall. Rakesh Khar is the managing editor of TV9 Business, and he's a experience. And the other panelist is Douglas Christian from Washington, D.C. He's a White House correspondent who does audio, video, text stories, in a way, a quintessential multimedia journalist. And our conversation today is pegged around India taking over the presidency of G20 nations. Leaders from these countries would be traveling to India over the next 6 to 7 months to participate in various working groups. And this is going to culminate with a summit sometimes in September in Delhi later this year. So I kick off this discussion by asking Mr. Khar, who is managing TV9. So what kind of angles or perspectives do you see, and should local journalists be looking for, especially those present in the cities where these events are being hosted? The sort of content which media houses would be interested, both in India and abroad?
Thank you, Sumit. First of all, congratulations on this new initiative that you have launched with two other common friends. So all the best. I think this freelance journalist category is going to grow as we speak. So in that sense, it also needs a platform, a window. So I think it should turn out to be a very promising opportunity for journalists too, especially those who are experienced and want to tell their story to the world at large. So in that sense, I think a great opportunity to watch out for. G20, coming to the theme of the day, G20 is quite an interesting subject. Though, India is very happy and is celebrating it every minute, every second, I would say. This comes by rotation. So in that sense, we had Indonesia doing it ahead of us, and now we have Brazil, taking it up for India. And relationship between India and Brazil and Indonesia in itself is a story to watch out for, because they fall in the emerging economy pack, and there's certain parallels. As I was telling Douglas yesterday, Economist did a piece independently on the India-Indonesia track when it comes to global economic growth story. So I can add a feather to it and say India, Indonesia, and Brazil. These are three watchable nations when it comes to looking at the economy and business as a segment. So G20 has so many sub-verticals, Sumit, and I'm amazed actually the way it's shaping up in India. I don't know how the world is looking at it, but let me just begin by the macro perspective. It started off essentially, as all of us know, as a key, 1999, followed by 2007, 2009, when it became the institutional at the head of the level platform as a macroeconomy solution, kind of a provider. But today it's all over. I think every subject, every domain, every business vertical is impacted by G20. It's another matter whether it's actually able to meet its stipulated agenda and deliverables are counted. But the activity itself is so phenomenal that it encompasses each and every aspect of life. Just to give you an example, it has in its listed agenda 5 key pillars, which are very, very comprehensive, all encompassing, from inclusive growth to anti-corruption, which is a common global agenda, to reorganizing the international economic platforms where India and the emerging economies and are expected to play a greater role, and then climate change. These are like very, very large pieces in themselves and have, so to say, interlinkages which form for great stories. At the sub-vertical level in the identified agenda for G20, as all of us would probably know, we have the women piece, we have the academia piece, we have the think tank piece, and then we have the culture and tourism piece. And the way India has structured it, I am not familiar with what Indonesia did right to the air, but that looks like a very, very busy schedule when it is G20 presidency in India. On the stated agenda, there are about 200 cities which are, so to say, in the ambit, and we have seen already the writs and the lights going to each city, small and big, and the story about G20 meeting in Srinagar is already created international headlines, with Pakistan opposing the idea and India saying that you please keep away from it. So in that sense, these 200 cities and these 6 to 10 big verticals themselves are foundations for large stories to do. And what India has done specifically, I think, merits an attention here is the micro. There's the macro picture, then there's the micro picture. At the micro level, the one aspect that we discussed is the city play. The other big aspect is that, I think there is a deliberate attempt, and I think there is some success in that, in basically mainstreaming G20 as from being a very, very esoteric international discussion platform to something that, really comes and hits you in your eye in a pleasant way. I'll just give you an example. I met Amitabh Khan right at the start of the presidency. I think it was Feb or January, and we did a sit-down, long interview with him on the broad themes. And he sounded very exciting, and he said that it's going to be on the tongue of each and every Indian, and they'll see what he's doing. They don't understand, they will be impacted. It will be something that they'll absorb as consumers. So a recent example is this the flower festival in Delhi, in the NDMC area, where there was in the Central Park in Connaught Place, for Douglas's reference. Connaught Place is a prime and area in the central part of Delhi, and there was such a lovely flower show which ran for a few weeks, and this show was as good, some people said, with in comparison to it. There's a presidential flower show which happens in almost in the same period at the president's house. So when you mainstream G20 as something which people can consume, so it makes for a great story. I don't know how many people bother to actually see what G20 means. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is an Indian mission, which means world is my family. But when they went and attended that flower show, I also happened to see that by chance. I saw that people were very happy to see the overall ambience. So in that sense, G20, to my mind, has become a very large piece for 1.4 crore Indians to look at, just for the sake of another big event. I know the government of India is often accused of being preoccupied, being a key event player, but I think when these large pieces are discussed globally, we have learned historically that if they remain in the realm of a conference room or an academic session, they really don't convey the message like they should. So in that sense, this mainstreaming, to my mind, is a good idea. And going forward, we have quite a few months till September when it finally culminates, where the heads of states are expected to come. There is an event almost, or 2 or 3 every month. So quite interesting time, quite interesting story. And when someone is looking at G20, as I mentioned, it has sub-themes which are transcending the traditional borders or beats, if I can use from a journalistic perspective. So it's for journalists to explore some really fascinating stories. So that's where I would rest my opening piece.
So thanks Rakesh for your initial comments. I'll go to Douglas for the next question. Morning, Douglas.
Good morning.
So you've covered both. You still cover, White House and Capitol. Now, whenever top world leaders visit United States, that makes for a story, and that also keeps journalists in Washington busy. For a freelancer who has been covering these events and the visits by these leaders, what do you think, what would be the tips that you would want to give to freelance journalists, the sort of stories that media houses look for, especially say if there is a summit meeting in Delhi. Now, not every organization in G20 countries uh, considering the sort of budget that we are operating in now, would have the money to send a journalist to Delhi. But if you have a set of credible journalists who can report for you, if you have boots on the ground, you can still generate good content. So, what sort of stories or the tips that you would want to give to freelance journalists, who would be covering these events over the next 6 or 7 months in India?
Well, first of all, be prepared before you run into a congressman or a president. Really have an idea of the questions that you're going to ask, because you never know when you're prowling the halls of the Capitol or even in DC in general, whether you'll run into, when you'll run into somebody. And so you need to kind of have a cheat sheet together of the things that you absolutely want to ask when that opportunity arises, because you never know when it will arise.
Yeah, but if you would want to elaborate on, the sort of content that the media houses would be interested in.
Right.
Especially in G20. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I do want to pick up on what Rakesh was talking about in terms of the G20 and also India's influence these days, also population. I mean, right now, probably in November, the world's population crossed 8 billion. This month, India became the most populous nation in the world. It overtook China. There's a huge story there about economics. Of course, Americans link capitalism with freedom, and yet what we're seeing with India is it's the world's largest democracy. It's and it's showing that maybe it's going to carry the banner forward for that kind of thinking. Whereas in China, what you're seeing is kind of a dictatorial state where it's almost getting moribund because it doesn't have the same degree of diversity of thought. Let's put it that way. And I would say that is an overarching theme in my mind, that there are so many questions to be asked, and I think that media houses will be interested in stories that impact all of us in a very big way.
So basically, you're saying that juxtaposing India as a democracy and the growing economy vis-a-vis China,
and contrasting with China, because China is was considered almost untouchable in terms of its economic growth, but now it's slowing due to many missteps. Well, not all missteps. I mean, some of it has been China's slowing birth rate, which has also meant that it doesn't have the number of people, young people, productive anymore. Whereas in India, we're seeing, well, it's different north and south, as you know, but it has overtaken China in terms of the birth rate. Just the sheer numbers of people alone means that there's more of a workforce.
Rakesh, I mean, you as an editor, you want to add something to that?
No, actually, this China-India story itself is so fascinating for the global audiences. And of course, it's relevant to India and China. Chinese media, of course, is too inward-looking and doesn't have the freedom to put it the way it should be put. But having said that, I think if you look at the latest IMF projection, for the current fiscal, India and China are supposed to be driving 50% of global economic growth. And then what Douglas said, the contradictions between China and India when it comes to approaching democracy, human rights, economy itself. The big story we were discussing yesterday when we were doing the tech check, Apple had a dramatic time in China, during COVID, and there was a clamp down by Chinese authorities. That's not the only reason China is moving. Apple is moving out of China. In fact, 6 countries that Tim Cook has identified as priority markets going forward, all the 6 are essentially G20 countries. So my only request right at the outset would be that let's not get too preoccupied by Russia-Ukraine story, whether they come. And I think there's this tempting urge in a section of the media here and outside that wants to, if it's happening, it's very good. If it's not happening, there's nothing happening in Ukraine. So I think there are lots happening in G20. I'm not saying maybe I'm biased because it's happening in India, but globally, as I said, the linkages between India and the G20 member countries are so enormous, and they're growing by the day. We live in an interconnected world, like I said before. We live in a VUCA world. So in that sense, my plea to journalists covering the G20 here and looking at India's story from the outside and inside out view, outside in view, is that there are lots happening and there are lots of fundamental theories to be examined and so to say explored and critiqued during the next few months. China plus India, is there area for convergence and divergence? Geopolitically, there is divergence. Geoeconomically, is there room for convergence? And then there's China plus one, then there's nearshoring, offshoring, moving manufacturing from China to India, and parallelly, China playing the big daddy in terms of negotiations with Iran and Saudi Arabia, and in fact, even going close to Russia, and then India-Russia relationship. So, I mean, at the geoeconomic, geopolitical level, there are brilliant stories to be told. And at the micro level, if a foreign journalist comes and sees Varanasi, and for example, sees the Varanasi Ghats, which are globally famous, and how the city has been transformed, and how a KFC and Costa Coffee and Starbucks coexist with a Haldiram. Haldiram Douglas is an Indian leader in the FMCG space for the fast food category, just to put it in context. So in that sense, stories lie today at intersection, politics, economy, culture, and society. Yeah. No longer beats are defined and should be defined in my mind in the traditional sense, because that's pretty limiting. That's where we get caught in the Russia-Ukraine binary, and the G20 has the risk of being, so to say, moving away from the media zone as we speak.
Yes, yesterday, you were mentioning this very interesting thing that, and you yourself have been, as an organization, have been experimenting with an OTT platform, long-form stories, video stories, TV9. And I think this is happening because you have the luxury now as journalists to work remotely and work multimedia and work on your own. So you can create some great stuff if you know the technology and how to harness that. As an editor, what sort of stories do you think you'd be interested in, considering the events which would happen, unfold in the next couple of months, as not only in terms of themes, as we have discussed, but also in terms of form, because form is also very important, currently. What would be selling on a desktop may not be the audience on mobile may not find that very interesting. So not only the themes, but forms also are very important for journalists to consider when they are filing stories. If you're doing an immersive, multimedia immersive, that might, a lot of international organizations might find that interesting vis-a-vis a long 800 word or 1,000 word piece. So as an editor, what sort of content in terms of form, various forms that you would be looking at?
Sumit, it's a very interesting question because I have been, so to say, challenging myself. I've done print, I've done television, I've done now digital, and digital, within digital I've done the linear version. I call website a linear version of a digital format. And now we have experimented with this OTT format. It's called News9 Plus for everyone's consumption. It's world's first news OTT platform. And my learning is that in today's age and time, we have grown up being saddled by, I'm using that word by choice, just about 5 or 6 media companies. You spend your lifetime being there, and with all the pluses and minuses. But I think today, because new forms have come into existence, there is room to experiment and also approach and, so to say, connect with far too many platforms. I don't know how many people know about News9 Plus. We are probably doing a large campaign next month so that many more people know about News9 Plus as a platform. Now, the platform itself is going to drive journalistic content and the appetite for it globally. When I say an app for a news content, look at the way it transcends borders. An app can be approached, and this particular app in this case can be approached universally in someone sitting in Botswana or someone sitting in, Mayur Vihar or say any part of the world. And if there is the storytelling format is good, I think news consumers globally are looking for great storytelling. They are not biased as much as they were in the past by their own preoccupation of their country data. I think that's the best thing for freelancers. If you're able to tell a story well, I drew the example of Varanasi being at the intersection of so many pieces. If you're able to tell that story from that perspective, I do believe that there is going to be huge interest. Newer and newer formats, Sumita, have. I mean, our colleague at Network 18, I'm happy to give a reference. Newsworthy, Anubha Bhosle, she worked with me first in UHZ, and then she really blossomed into wonderful professional. It has far bigger numbers on Instagram as a standalone news entity than many of the traditional peers who have joined the bandwagon in the last few years. So she's keeping it so simple. If you look at Newsworthy on Instagram, so there are journalistic platforms which are credible, which have made storytelling a delight, and they're doing so as standalone entities where the cost to entry is so easy. I mean, there's no entry barrier in terms of cost and technology. As I said, from 5 big media platforms to today we have 50,000. My own sense is in the next 10 years, as digitization really keeps us alive and kicking and growing, we will have many more platforms. But yes, the caveat is the comma full stop journalist era is over. You need to reinvent, reimagine, rescale, unlearn, most important, quite a few skill sets to be able to tell that story. I'm happy Douglas is even more, empowered in that sense because he edits his own stories. Coming back to News 9 Plus, what we're doing is we're trying to marry what we call Netflix kind of an experience in terms of the packaging of the story. We may not be right there right away, but we're trying, and I think we're about 60-70%.
Yeah.
And then we are also looking at India Today or a Time magazine journalistic data. When you marry the two, that's what this app is all about, and that's where the opportunity is.
So that's a very interesting experiment that you're trying. Douglas, going back to the discussion we were having yesterday. Now, you, in a true sense, are a multimedia journalist. You do audio.
This is kind of the multimedia realm.
You have an audio studio and a video studio there.
Yeah.
You do your own production and you do your own recordings, pre-production stuff. And I've seen some of your stuff which you had uploaded on 5WH. Now, increasingly, because of the technology, media organizations and journalists also are being able to collaborate internationally across borders to do stories. And that collaboration has led to some very fine journalism. Not only investigative journalism, which we have seen over the last 5 or 10 years, but some big investigative stories have come out, media organizations across the globe collaborating. But storytelling, video storytelling also. 5WH also provides functionalities wherein you can collaborate with journalists who are registered on 5WH. And you can create content together. So in that respect, I would want to ask you that, what sort of stories, because a lot of our journalists, a pool of journalists that we have, around 60, 70 are from India, equal number from the United States. So if these two set of journalists were to collaborate for storytelling, so what sort of stories or content do you think can be created? And have you experimented with collaborative content creation in the past?
I've only been collaborating with people in the White House and Capitol Hill, people such as Lalit, in terms of our stories. But I do feel that if you're experienced enough in storytelling, that you'll viscerally know when something excites you, when something grabs you. There has to be an arc to the story. There has to be a conflict. There has to be a struggle. There has to be a solution. I mean, if you just are too didactic and you're just telling, it's this, well, that's a yawn fest. People are gonna fall asleep. This is why people, why people revert back to Donald Trump, is because over and over again, he provides excitement and conflict. And yet there are so many other stories out there that are fascinating and interesting that don't just revolve around this one person. They revolve around the, climate change and food insecurity, especially with rice. Things that can really affect people. Money, the G20, we were talking about the G20, and of course, there's this great debate now going on whether we've lost the era of low inflation, which seems too abstract right now. So every story has to be tied to a person. It has to be tied to something that you can relate to. A person trying to buy a home, somebody, and then that person, you can tie it back to the bigger picture of something. So if you have those two, the conflict, the very basic story of something that really grabs somebody right close in, and then that is the microcosm that tells the larger tale. I think you've got a winning formula there. And if you can collaborate with people that are maybe not, like, I'm not in London, but let's say there's something going on in London with 5WH, could reach out to London and say, all right, let's figure out the story. But it's got to have the elements of storytelling in it. So, and journalism. So it's got to have the elements that we just talked about and journalism, and then you can combine and put it together.
Yeah, thanks, Douglas. So I would also request, our the other people who've joined in, our guests, if they have any questions or they have any observations to make, they can make a request, and I'll unmute them and they can join in this conversation. Anybody who would want to make a point here is most welcome.
There is a question in the chat.
Just a moment, if I can see.
Says, how much would the Russian aggression in Ukraine impact G20 this year? Well, it's already impacting, right? And so the question is, there's so many stories there about food insecurity, especially in India and also Horn of Africa.
And Rakesh?
As I said, I think there is obviously a cloud of Russia-Ukraine on G20. But the way it has manifested under Indian presidency, I think there's no dearth of stories being covered outside of this particular domain. And yesterday in Washington, the FM did a meeting of finance ministers and senior leaders in G20 on debt restructuring, on crypto. So I think there are very, very important pieces that have to be addressed. And I'm an optimist. I do believe that we'll have some convergence on the core contentious issues. But globally, multilateral platforms like G20 will have, that festering sword at one level. At the same time, there are so many areas for working together. Like India has the export of the digital stack, what we call digital public infrastructure, which is a big ticket idea that India is selling to the world, which includes the UPI, which includes the Janadan, it includes. So I think that's a big import from India, which probably is of huge relevance to the emerging economy fact. And I'm not saying because we are in India, but it's a story to be told because it impacts the end consumer. I completely agree with Douglas. The storytelling has to reside at the macro, and the micro have to marry each other so well. I mean, only a micro telling stories, he said this, he added that, and then this and this. Macro is, it sets the context. Like, we did the story yesterday on coal in News 9 Plus. It should be uploaded today. I mean, the West is, at Hope is accusing emerging countries of, so to say, penalizing us for, emissions that, and India has committed itself to a 2075 target, but that's a long haul. In the meantime, in the interim, we presented India's perspective, and the per capita consumption of fossil fuel, which is driven by coal, is much higher in Western economies than in India. But the only regret in doing that story was that I didn't have a Western perspective. So when you talk of collaboration, I wish I had known Douglas earlier, or he could have recommended someone, or 5WH could have suggested a piece, because ultimately the core area that should define any journalistic piece should be balance. That's where we divorce ourselves from any core agendas. But there are inaccuracies, there are pressure groups, the Western world has a certain view on the emerging fact, and that is constantly being put under question. India and many other countries are seeking the reform of the UN. We did that piece also at News 9 Plus. But the missing part was there was no global voice in that. So I'm happy to, so to say, use this platform. Sumit, to answer your question, if it has robust credentials of people who will be able to tell that story from a purely independent standpoint, and do say that if emerging world is looking at having some challenges, point them out. But if there are challenges in the narrative setting from the developed economies, see, this big story is developed economies versus emerging economies. And within emerging economies, again, there is a huge battle going on, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, Brazil, they're all competing for that little piece of the growth pie. I mean, India has been a leader in the IT pack, doing about 150, $180 billion of exports. But there again, Vietnam, Philippines is nipping it out, at us. And, we have the competitiveness of the labor and the real estate. But that again is coming under pressure. So these are interesting times. Stories from India are no longer stories from India. Stories from Vietnam are no, they have an interconnectivity. And if we are able to get in the right coordinates and put them all together, believe me, Sumit and Douglas, storytelling as such and journalism as such will get in.
Yeah, for instance, Pakistan last year was the biggest story of climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm surprised. In fact, we did a story the day IMF approved the debt restructuring plan for Sri Lanka. It took about 2.5 years, but for Ukraine, IMF did it in record time. I mean, why should Sri Lanka suffer? I mean, a citizen's perspective. Nobody has talked about it. What is so special about Ukraine? Because you're bedded in there, you've got your boots in there, you're spending money in actually furthering a war on either side. I'm not supporting US or India. But I'm saying when you put it in context and say that Sri Lanka struggled so hard to get that package done. And look at the caveats they have built in. There's a caveat that IMF has done that you have to enforce corruption free. Who can enforce that? Even the most honest administrator, will have to, we really have to work hard to ensure that the money that is given is spent in a manner that is corruption free. They can make a commitment, but nobody can enforce it.
Douglas, you have worked as a freelance journalist, and even I've been working as a freelance journalist for the last 2 years, and with various organizations for 2 decades before that. It's my experience personally has been that it's not easy to work independently as an independent journalist. It's a really tough job. When you're working for an institution or organization, you have an institutional backup, a support system, not just in terms of say a camera person accompanying a reporter. You have a legal team who's standing behind you. You have an editorial support who's vetting your story, looking into it. As a freelance journalist, you're just on your own. At times, even driving your car and looking for stories. So you've been a freelance and an independent journalist for a very long time, and increasingly, I find, at least in India, that a lot more journalists are looking at journalism from a very different perspective, from not a traditional newsroom perspective, but as content creators and independent content creators, because they can now reach out to a very large audience without being associated with an institution. So what are the challenges for a freelance or an independent journalist to operate in this environment?
It's a great question, Sumit. I think that as you know, you have to find the hook that grabs people in, but the thing is, you don't want to be the person that is throwing out garbage or clickbait or stuff that's wrong. So, I mean, you've got a choice to make, and that is you're either going to look for things that are really solid and so solid that people want to see it, or you're going to, lie, or you're going to just say stupid stuff because you know that it will get views. And I mean, I would strongly recommend against the latter, and really toward the former, and that is find that stuff that really makes you unique. And as you said, and what I found and what I've really been looking at is you can now be your own production. You can be your own production studio. You can do that. And, and it can start with just something as simple as an iPhone, but it can also go to, something like this, where you see, but everything in between, it's the power of the story. The question then becomes, as a producer of your own work that is marketed out, the quality not only of the story but of your content. I mean, there are a few map makers on YouTube that have garnered huge amount of followers and clicks, because of their graphics with using maps. And in fact, one of them was saying in a conference I was recently, he said, I used to just kind of put my face up as a thumbnail on YouTube. He said people didn't want that. They wanted the maps. They wanted to see the geography of things. And so he's been doing that, and he's got, 7 million followers. And I feel that, so you've got to find your niche that is strong, that really makes you, that makes you a desirable commodity, your work a desirable commodity.
Yeah, thanks.
So, if I may add, what would make a freelancer's work tick? I think obviously format, quality, that Douglas so rightly outlined. He's himself a living example of that. But I think very, very important from the freelancer's perspective is cost efficiency. See what's happening globally and also in India. News gathering cost is being put down, and it's we were discussing it yesterday. The editorial cost is under the hammer, right here, wrong. So in that sense, everybody wants a good story, but nobody is willing to pay for it. And there is the news managers. The news managers are under pressure from the organizational hierarchy when it comes to the P&L. So people would be willing to spend on marketing rather than pure play editorial. Though TV9 has been a unique rival in that sense, because we've really spent a lot of money sending people to war zones, and that has given us results. But that's another matter. So when it comes to cost efficiency, I think the freelancer has to learn and adopt from what the model that Douglas has. Because if a traditional news organization would have 4 people doing this job into a certain cost, 4 into X, if they learn the skills like Douglas is mentioning, it becomes 1 by 4. So that's where the cost efficiency comes in. I'm not saying compromise on quality. Never said that. I repeat, you have to learn to multitask to be able to make that relevance to the news manager. Everybody is looking at a story, but he's not willing to pay as much for it. So if it comes in the realm of cost efficiency, I think it's going to be extremely welcome across news organizations. So for instance, 5WH is able to give us 5 inputs as talking heads, because now essentially the entire storytelling is in video. So we need a guy like, say, Douglas, or maybe, in 5 parts of the world to give us an idea of what's happening on the Ukraine war, for instance, or what's happening on the petro economy, post Russia becoming a big player, with India driving its imports on, oil from Russia, changing the global, oil economy order. But I can't tell this story completely from there. But I would like someone in Russia, someone in US, someone in the Middle East, the 3 key fulcrums to my mind. Give us that perspective in 60 seconds on a nice video, and probably, organize a guest there with him. So the job is done.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. That's very interesting.
There's one question. My friend Ranjit. Ranjit, good to see you here. Thank you for joining and taking time out. So, your question on whether G20 should come back to the core economic agenda, I think, that goes without any doubt. India, as I said yesterday, also the FM stuck to our core agenda on the economic piece, because without that, the most important architecture of G20 wouldn't be met. And India has lots to do there. It has to reform it's pushing for creating a new order on debt restructuring. It's creating a new order on getting bigger, say in the IMF and World Bank when it comes to releasing of money. I gave you the Sri Lanka example, so that in the quota business we have a bigger say. And of course, the inclusive growth is one big piece, which is bordering on the larger macroeconomic policy and also the microeconomic policy. Right, back to you, Sumit.
Yeah, thanks, Rakesh. You were saying something, Douglas.
What I was saying was based on Rakesh, what he was saying about having the quality. You cannot skirt the quality of what you're doing, because people, before people were literate in reading and writing, but now they're visually literate. So if they see something that is just not well done, they're going to turn off. I mean, Casey Neistat, the famous YouTuber, said every second counts. You waste 1 second in the very beginning, the people are going to move on, unless it's really an important issue. Lalit and I do kind of roundup of what's going on in the White House. But so people who watch that, they want to watch that because they just want to hear the what's going on. But if you really want to grab people, you have to think about the quality of what you're sending out. Fortunately, in today's age, there are so many resources for brushing up on your technical abilities. Of course, YouTube has tons of tutorials. There's Skillshare, there's LinkedIn Learning. I recommend all of them in order to build your abilities so that you can tell the best story possible. But I think also getting back to something else that Rakesh said about the collaboration with the 5WH, and that is that you could be your own producer here at 5WH, where one person can say, look, I really want to do a story on cryptocurrency. I want to get some segments from India. I want to get some segments from Europe. I want to get some segments from the United States, and I want to tie them together into one video package to send out. That could be a very powerful story. That gives the freelancer almost the power of a major news organization to be able to kind of produce such a thing and be able to send it out, which 5WH could do, can give that kind of opportunity.
Very interesting, because earlier this year, if I'm not wrong, you filed a couple of stand-ups ahead of the US midterms. Now, Rakesh, I saw those stand-ups he did from the White House and edited stand-ups with all the information. I think it was 90 seconds, 60 seconds, 60 seconds, which would be around 3.5 minutes stand-up. And Douglas had put it up on 5WH Marketplace for, I think, $20, like 1,600 rupees. Now, I don't think anybody in India, any media house in India, would be getting a stand-up from White House for 1,600 rupees. I mean, you won't even get a stringer do a story for 1,600, a video story. So that saves you're right, that saves a lot of cost for media houses, especially at a time when increasingly we find that media houses are not spending on storytelling, story content creation. Half an hour of debate between 3 or 4 people doesn't cost much. And you're inviting 4 people, paying 20,000 rupees. But at the same point in time, 20 minutes of good quality content, that's going to cost you a lot of money. But that's what television and storytelling is. Thank you very much, Rakesh and Douglas, for joining us. And thanks to all the guests for joining in today. This was our first experiments. This program was delayed for a while because we had some technical glitch. We apologize for that. But very soon we would be coming up with our next event. Thanks again very much.
Thank you, Sumit.
Thank you, Sumit.
Thank you.
Yeah, do share a list of people at your end who are available globally, and we will be happy to explore story ideas for News9 Plus. Thank you.
And I would want TV9 if you can join the platform and take a look at the sort of content.
Yeah, we will do that. As I said, I mentioned some specific stories. Do identify the credentials. If Douglas is a freelancer, I would be happy to use him if he finds it appetizing. Because the rate at which he's available at 5WH are appetizing. And of course, he himself is so bright.
So, for instance, Prime Minister Modi would be visiting US later this year. And not many media organizations can actually send their reporters to cover that. Yeah. Now, if you have a set of 25, 30 reporters.
I would just conclude, Sumit, the good thing is that the quality, the cost of technology is coming down. So, if you have to book a field, because now you can go on Zoom and all that are not great broadcast quality, but there are better platforms available. But finding the right mix and match journalistically is a bit of a challenge, I think, in India and globally. But if you're able to put in that hard work and identify those resources, I think your relevance would be of huge importance, to news media organizations. And globally, Sumit, there are platforms like FSN and all that, which provide such services. But maybe you can look at their tariff and create a tariff chart going forward, which is much more common.
Thank you. Thanks for the suggestions. Thanks, everyone. See you.
Thank you. Have a great day. Bye.
Great to see you, Sumit. Hi.
Bye. Thanks, Douglas.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invite. Bye.